All right. So, hello everyone. In today's video, I wanted to focus on just a broad understanding of how can you improve as a first speaker. This is of course, one of the positions that you could practice a lot continuously in debate because you can do it on your own. You could record as many prime minister speeches as you want. Um, but what's more important, in my opinion, is not only the repetition of many first speeches, but and the exposure, of course, with many different topics so that you could be challenged as a first speaker. It is the acknowledgement of what should I do given the limitation of being a first speaker, which is that you should be humble in acknowledging that you are going to face a very uncertain round ahead, but at the same time, that you have to require or that you are required to address some fundamental components in a round that will increase your chances of success significantly. And in my opinion, whenever I'm coaching kids and then trying to train them and teach them how to get better as a first speaker, it's always a matter of helping them acknowledge what are the building blocks of a first speaker. What are the essential components of a first speaker? And what facet of first speaking do you want to improve on first? Because progression is not a one by one endeavor, nor is it simply like step by step. It is a matter of knowing that some skills, like the underlying skills of framing, the underlying skills of argumentation and proving, and the discipline of being comprehensive and then trying to be as preemptive as possible, those are things that mutually reinforce the essential building blocks of being a first speaker. And so on one hand, it's a matter of knowing and getting better at those critical thinking skills, but on the other hand, it's about knowing how to strategize and compartmentalize these skills in the parts that matter the most for the first speech that you are about to deliver. Now that's a very difficult insight. That's a very difficult insight because a lot of first speakers always rush into the argument, rush into just doing all the framing that they want, trying to respond to every single argument that's very possible, and then also controlling the debate because they feel that that's the most important thing that they have to do. But that's not always the most profitable long-term development strategy for you, because if you are fixated on the perfect first speech and that you have to always fulfill your checklist however you think they are, it reduces your potential to incrementally appreciate the improvements on each and every component. And so that's what I want to tackle today. So there are essentially 4 particular components to a first speech that you should, as much as possible, prioritize. Even in a team case, for example, if you're in world schools and you are working as a team to build the first speaker case, because that's very important. It's very critical to be disciplined on giving your first argument, your second argument, providing your team line, providing your team case, providing your model and all that other stuff. Like this stuff is non-negotiable. And so there are 4 things. Number 1, it is almost always important that you have some context and some frame that is thematically introduced in the speech, because you're presenting your team's case, and your team's case has an underlying frame, or if you want the term, it's an overarching frame and an overarching context that envelops the entire case, right? So this is what you need to establish at the start of the speech, such as saying that this is a debate about nationalism as a collective identity, as opposed to the other collective identities that individuals default towards. And so it is not about whether nationalism is good or bad. It is necessarily about nationalism as related and as a collective identity that has improved, that has changed over time, and we will be evaluating those aspects of nationalism the most. So that's a frame. That's a very important frame. It is contextualized within the context of, evolving nationalism and changing nationalism. And it moves away from a very simple context of nationalism being good or bad. You would also need to talk about the model and the stance, which includes what you specifically support and what is the relevant change in the debate. Now, these aspects also are included in, or at least I think they would also apply very meaningfully even in a value judgment debate, which is, even in a value judgment debate or any analysis debate, even if we're a more harm than good debate, even, you would still be explaining, well, what do you specifically support and what aspects do you think are most important? Like, even if it were a social media has done more harm than good, you would still be explaining that our side thinks that social media has ruined the social lives of our generation. And that you say that the aspects of social media that have been most pernicious in society, right? You're not going to say, like, commercialization is just bad in general. Like, you're not going to be doing that, right? You're going to say the particular way in which algorithms were designed in social media, the particular way in which it hijacked our lives and our consumption of media has changed the way we interact with each other and in the world. And so you're like, what we support then, and what we specifically say at Gov, is that even if we acknowledge many of the social benefits that have come from social media, what we specifically oppose is the way in which it has broadly changed our social lives for worse. And so you're like, oh, okay, so that's the relevant mutually exclusive condition by which you are, delineating what's more harm than good, right? And you're saying that this is what we mean by more harm than good. This is what we are explaining. If it were a policy, then obviously this would include a model, some explanation of what are the specific facets of that model that make it very different than the status quo, etc. And then this is where it gets a little bit challenging, right? Any first speech will almost always include some element of a principal justification and some element of an immediate effect or an immediate benefit. Now, I don't want to default to the language of, oh no, you should have one principled argument, you should have one pragmatic argument, because whether you're a beginner debater, whether you're an advanced debater, these delineations do not always like help in your understanding of debate, right? Because any argument will always have an underlying moral framework and a moral principle that you are trying to implicitly forward as a consequence of that argument. And any principle is tied with some concrete manifestation that is tied with the fulfillment of the motion or of the argument, right? And so that is why the way that I'm trying to teach this is, you think of, well, why should we have the policy? What is the justification? And then that involves underlying weighing, right? The weighing as to why this uniquely is a policy that we want to defend because of the duties or obligations associated to that, or the justification associated with it. And so even if you acknowledge that it includes some practical consequence, that there's still an urgency, like an underlying moral urgency behind that, which you will still have to defend. That is the principal justification. Beyond this, there is the immediate effect, which is that even if it were a value judgment motion, you are still explaining that there is some mechanism that creates that harm, right? Some consequence, some impact. And even if it were any principled motion, you would still be explaining that our side is defending a principle a little bit more than something else, such as, for example, if you were defending inheritance, then you are explaining that there is the right to property that is defended by the manifestation of inheritance. And so, how does inheritance facilitate transfers of wealth, thereby promoting the principal justification that this is going to help individuals across generations because they otherwise would not have had the autonomy to be able to have that wealth and that starting point of their life if not for the ability to be supported by other families before them. And so it's like, okay. So now it's like a little bit clearer how the immediate effect stuff, like even if you're making an entire like argument on the moral illegitimacy of inheritance, you're still explaining what happens with inheritance, right? So that is what I mean by an immediate effect. What are the immediate effects? What are the immediate mechanisms that should be prioritized, that should be characterized a lot in the round? Let's move on to an example. An example that I would use for this video would be in the motion, this House would legalize the sale of organs. So again, what I've designed so far is a very, very simple, basic, fundamental structure. I don't want to call this a template, because by calling it a template, I'm assuming that you guys will always try and just copy the template and then just use it however you want. But think of it, instead of as a template, think of it as a structure, like a structure deck in Yu-Gi-Oh, right? Whenever you have a structure deck from Yu-Gi-Oh, you're not gonna just copy the structure deck. You're going to acknowledge that, yeah, you know what they're trying to do by encouraging me to use these 7 monsters that are dragon type. I want to utilize dragon type monsters because they're compatible with the other spells in the particular deck, in the structure deck. But if I have better dragon type monsters that could replace these dragon type monsters in the structure deck, then I could improve that and I'll change it. So this is why it's a structure, right? It's a structure that you could interchange, you could replace, you could improve, but the fundamentals still remain, the essentials still remain, that I think that 7 dragon type monsters overall in the structure deck is a very, very good recommendation for giving a very, very good, reliable speech. Sorry, having a good deck. All right. So in the motion, this House legalized sale of organs. This is how I might do it. Context and frame. Relying on organ donation is not enough. A lot of people are desperate for organ transplants and are at risk of dying. As a consequence, since they already turn to the black market where there is less protection, it is necessary for the state to intervene. So what are we doing? The frame, essentially, right? Beyond what we explained earlier, what the frame does is it explains that this is uniquely defended by the motion, that there is a problem in the motion, in the status quo, that people are desperate, the black market exists, and so the real comparative in the round is that people need protection, and that is provided by the state. And so now you've utilized the frame that this is a debate about state intervention, that will talk a lot about what legalization specifically means. And so I am hoping that this round is going to focus on the consequences and benefits of legalization. Model. The state will legalize the sale of organs. What does this include? It includes the creation of a public market in coordination with various hospitals around the country. Once a sale has been made and certified, the transplant will proceed, and then the donors will be compensated. These transactions will be documented by the state. And so you've clarified the model. You can do this in 1 minute, 30 seconds? And I think that's quite efficient. It's quite nice. And even if you don't know yet how you could improve on this vastly, right? Like from a very, very basic fundamental standpoint, this is already very good, by the way, because you've specified what the model specifically is, and you've already said that there is a problem We need to solve it. State intervention is the specific thing we're defending that we think needs to be put for consideration in this round. Now, I will run two arguments in this speech. Number one, I will talk about the principal justification. It is legitimate for the state to do this. And number two, organ transplant becomes safer under this model. So, again, I want you guys to understand that whenever we make an argument, there's always like you don't just think about many arguments and you just list it and then you just choose the best one. You want to think of, well, what are the most immediate consequential things that I must do in the round for us to have a very strong winning chance. So since I have framed the round as something related to the black market and necessary state intervention, then now it is important for me to explain why the state should do this, even if it were at the cost of some principle, which is the trade-off in the round, and why we do actually save lives as a consequence, and we do make a better market that is created from legalization. And that those two things fulfill the frame. That's the frame that we're doing. That's our team line. That's our thematic case. This makes it a lot easier for my second speaker to develop other ideas a little bit more that are related to that frame, such as if it were not about safety, if it were not about legitimacy of the state, now you're going to talk about maybe it's about how people become more willing to become involved in the public health system. We restore trust in the public health system. Now we reduce costs in the state so that they don't have to be burdened by having to pay for very high specialty facilities that could facilitate these organ transplants, because now we have more and more individuals that are opting into the system and paying for those costs themselves. So second speaker can do all of those special economic arguments and all those social arguments if they wanted to, but those would not work if the first speaker was not effective in explaining the fundamentals of legalization and the principal trade-off in the first place. Which is why don't underestimate your duty as a first speaker. This is quite important. So here's the principal justification that I would do, and notice how you could eventually evolve this and improve this over time. I would say it is legitimate for the state to do this. Preemption. Op may explain that it is immoral to monetize one's organs, but this is simply less important than the right to autonomy for an individual. And of course, you can improve this by, explaining a little bit more about what is Op's preemption contingent on, Op's argument contingent on, what is their assumption. You could find a better preemption that you think is more attuned to the trade-off that you're defending on your side. Or you could find another way to try and insert the importance of your principle, right? It doesn't always have to manifest as a preemption. But what I'm trying to induce here, and I'm encouraging this, is that you want to acknowledge that I need to address this trade-off. And so I have to find the fastest way for me to already address this trade-off and show the mutual exclusivity of our principle and why we are defending this the most. So now here's our explanation. The right to bodily autonomy is connected with one's agency and their ability to determine the priorities for themselves. This is why we allow people to participate in risky activities, even if it may endanger their life. Of course, what you're doing here in the principal justification is you're providing a framework and a set of standards by which opposition can respond and evaluate this principle. And of course, you're proving the principle, and its applicability with the motion, which is why you can do this more and more and you'll get better and better. But the point is, what you need to do in the principle, in any justification, is explain what is the underlying principle of the principle. Now, I will eventually make another lecture on principles later on, but the point is, you can't just assert a principle to be important in general, right? There is always some intuition, but not just intuition. There is an underlying, weighing of obligations associated to the principle that you're saying, which is that the state has to prioritize the ability to defer to the preferences of individuals. And so here's a very important way that you could evolve this explanation, right? You could say that, even if opposition says that a lot of people are coerced, right? Are coerced into organ donation, organ donation, and selling their organs, at Gov, we explained that we are enabling their agency more because their ability to sell off their organs for money and their ability to utilize that money for themselves to actualize what is, their obligations to other people, like paying for their family's bills, paying for and having a better life for their family. These are fundamental goods that are associated with their priorities, which is why it's not just a debate about being coerced or not being coerced. It's a debate about what does bodily autonomy specifically promote, and why is agency specifically important, and what should the state do as a consequence. So now it's like, okay, that is one very nice way to improve the principle here. But the point is, elucidate the principle, underlying principle beneath it. Why is this important? A vast majority of people in need of a transplant are already facing the risk of losing their life, and it's not enough to rely on donations in order to protect their lives and preserve the agency of others. This market should be legalized. And so, what we're doing when we explain the importance of this principle is situating it with other, other trade-offs in the round, or other potential weighing metrics of the round, which is that, we're reminded of our context. Our context is that people are at risk of losing a life. People are already very desperate. So, you know what? We want to help those people because they otherwise would not have an organ transplant. We have an obligation to them. And that if we could do that by helping other individuals get money, then yes, we will definitely do that. That is the most important thing in this round. That is why we should legalize it. Even if we, for example, undermine the choices of some other people, or even if some people lose money in the process because they're forced to pay out those money because they're very desperate for that. Because those trade-offs are relatively easier for your second speaker to play along with, respond with, whatever. But as long as you've set the foundation, right? It's not even that you're not addressing the foundation, right? You're addressing it very cleanly from the very beginning, that this is our context. Now, you've addressed that this is our justification for everything. And then, of course, this immediate effect part is a mechanism that makes it easier for you to situate this in any other argument that you will do later on. So what I would do is I would focus on safety. I would say organ transplant becomes safer under this model. Preemption, Op may explain that organ transplants are risky and people will be coerced to sell their organs even if they are poor, but they forget that the black market already exists and is coercive. So independent of the principled response that I provided earlier, what we also provide is that the practical implication of their model of banning the sale of organs is that people will be in the black market, they have less information, they're more exploited, etc., etc. What is the explanation here? Creating a legal market allows the state to set up regulations and inform the public of the risks of organ transplants. This also creates legitimate processes within hospitals, making these procedures safer. Why is this important? This protects the most vulnerable group of individuals that opposition may want to defend, those who are poor and in need of donations. Notice how even in an effect argument, as a first speaker, right, you focus on a critical mechanism, the creation of a legal market allows for blah, 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 but you're still tying it with other contentions in a round. So that is a very nice leverage point for first speakers, right? They notice that any practical argument, right, once you get a specific nuanced benefit, what is the underlying principled obligations that you are promoting as a consequence of that immediate effect and that immediate benefit? And I think that's very advantageous for a lot of first speakers. Like that practice, being in like tune with this habit of always, the term that people usually use might be impacting, but I just want to use the term, just weighing and explaining the importance of these claims. That is a very, very, very foundational exercise that I think should encourage you to be more rigorous whenever you're making these arguments. All right, fantastic. So again, what's the bottom line? The bottom line of this video was that it's very difficult to be a good first speaker, what more to be a brilliant first speaker, but rather than just copying, your favorite first speakers, or copying a template, or the transcript of how they make speeches and whatever lines they use, just remember that all first speeches have these fundamental components that at some point they're gonna frame, at some point they're gonna model, Usually both of these are in the introduction. At some point in their argument, there's going to be some principled justification that is relatively more principled, and at some point they're going to argue something that is relatively more effect based and some immediate effect that is related to the motion. And those are the parts that you can definitely be in control of. You can definitely utilize those the most so that you could you know reach that point when you do feel that you're controlling the round, that you are setting up the debate very, very, very well from the very beginning. And so that's pretty much it. That I think that's already a very, very, very incredible success for a lot of people. All right, fantastic. All right, so thank you everyone. Have a great day and enjoy.